Imagine Karl Marx, the bearded revolutionary, waking up in 2025. He blinks into a world of glass skyscrapers, digital empires, and billionaires colonizing space. His eyes narrow. This isn't the collapse of capitalism he predicted, but it's a world he'd recognize, a world of obscene inequality, where the top 1% hoard half the global wealth while millions drown in debt. The promise of a house, a job, a future feels like a nightmare for most. Marx would see his ideas, misunderstood, twisted, but alive, echoing in protests, memes, and the quiet desperation of a crumbling middle class. Yet he'd wince at the word communist, a term so stained by history it's become a jinx, avoided even by those who share his critique. Today, we're diving into what Marx would make of 2025. Proud of his enduring influence, furious at how his vision was betrayed, or hopeful that the cracks in the system signal a turning point? Let's find out. If Marx scrolled through 2025's headlines, skyrocketing rents, stagnant wages, millions sleeping on the streets, he'd nod grimly. The contradictions I warned about. He'd say. They're piling up. Capitalism hasn't crumbled, but it's mutated into something sleeker, shinier, and more ruthless. Tech oligarchs like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, whose wealth surged $2 trillion during the pandemic, rule not with steel but with algorithms. They're the new bourgeoisie, cloaked in hoodies instead of top hats. Marx's core insight was that capitalism thrives on exploitation, creating wealth for the few by squeezing the many. In 2025, that's undeniable. The bottom 50% of earners own just 2.5% of global wealth, while the richest 1% hold half of all stocks and mutual funds. The dream of stability, a home, a family, a future, feels like a taunt. Homeownership is increasingly out of reach, with first-time buyers waiting years longer than past generations. Marx would see this as proof. The system's logic demands endless growth, but that growth comes at the cost of workers, families, and the planet itself. Yet he'd be proud. His framework, class struggle, exploitation, contradictions, still shapes how we analyze power. Every politician decrying income inequality, or union leader rallying for fair wages is, knowingly or not, standing on Marx's shoulders. His ideas are tools, not relics, and they're everywhere, though few dare call them Marxist, for fear of the baggage that label carries. Let's zoom in on the promise of prosperity through a simple story Marx would understand: the cobbler. Picture a skilled artisan crafting boots, setting prices based on materials, time, and expertise. It's a modest living, but it's honest. Now enter the capitalist. With loans or inherited wealth, they buy a factory, hire workers to specialize, cut leather, sew, assemble. Boots flood the market faster, cheaper. The consumer wins, right? Not quite. Each worker earns less than the cobbler ever did. The capitalist takes a cut, and if they're greedy, they slash wages, skimp on quality, or jack up prices. In theory, competition keeps them honest. Adam Smith's invisible hand, turning selfishness into fairness. But in 2025, that hand is more like a fist. Globalization shattered the dream's foundation. Post-World War II, companies built empires on mass production and a booming middle class. But by the late 20th century, they realized they could save billions by moving factories to countries with weaker labor laws. Sweatshops churned out goods, shipped back at a markup. The result? A hollowed-out working class, with wages for non-college educated workers stagnant or declining, while prices soared over 200% in decades. Marx would rage. This isn't competition, it's exploitation on a global scale. Workers now juggle multiple gig jobs, drowning in tens of thousands in average consumer debt. The promise of stability, a job, a home, retirement, is slipping away. Marx would call it what it is: a system that devours its own people to feed the wealthy. Didn't know about carbon emissions, but he wrote about the metabolic rift, capitalism's rupture between human production and nature's balance. In 2025, that rift is a chasm. Wildfires rage, floods devastate, and millions face displacement. The planet is paying interest on capitalism's debt. Eco-socialists, drawing directly from Marx, argue that endless growth is unsustainable. Movements for sustainable planning, climate justice, and democratic control over production echo his call to prioritize people and the planet over profit. Marx would see climate change as capitalism's ultimate contradiction, a class war where the system threatens humanity itself. He'd be furious at greenwashing, where corporations slap eco-friendly labels on the same old exploitation. But he'd also see hope in climate strikes and grassroots movements, proof that his method, analyze, adapt, resist, still sparks rebellion, even if the word communism makes activists flinch. But Marx's sharpest rage would be reserved for the regimes that claimed his name. Lenin's Soviet Union, Mao's China, Pol Pot's Cambodia, he denounced them as grotesque betrayals. These weren't the worker-led emancipations he envisioned but authoritarian nightmares, state capitalisms, masquerading as communism. Lenin's centralized control, Mao's Cultural Revolution, which killed millions, and Pol Pot's genocidal purges, claiming up to 2 million lives, these were abominations to Marx's dream of democratic, collective power. He'd point a shaking finger and roar, "You build prisons in the name of freedom!" These regimes, he'd argue, proved him right about power's tendency to consolidate without true democracy, but they also broke his heart. They twisted his ideas into tools for oppression, replacing one ruling class with another, party elites instead of bourgeoisie. In 2025, this betrayal fuels a deeper wound, the jinx of his name. Marxist and communist are radioactive labels, shunned even by those who critique capitalism's excesses. The horrors of Mao's Great Leap Forward, Lenin's purges, and Pol Pot's killing fields have tainted his legacy, making activists wary of openly embracing his ideas. Marx would lament this, not out of ego, but because it stifles the revolutionary clarity he sought to inspire. Yet he'd see his influence persist, cloaked in softer terms like social justice or economic fairness, proving his ideas endure despite the stigma. Marx would scoff at the myth of the free market. In 2025, corporate lobbying, billions spent annually, ensures the wealthy drown out everyone else. Tax loopholes stay open, bailouts flow to failing corporations, and stock buybacks artificially inflate value. Competition? It's dying. Tech giants face antitrust complaints for swallowing rivals through mergers and predatory pricing. This isn't capitalism as Adam Smith imagined, it's techno-feudalism. AI replaces workers, not to improve lives but to cut costs. Billionaires like Bezos, whose wealth grew 123% during the pandemic, aren't just rich, they're untouchable. Marx would call them the new aristocracy, ruling a system where personal freedoms collapse alongside personal wealth. He'd point to history, the 1920s, when 0.1% held a third of wealth, ended in economic collapse. Government intervention once saved capitalism by empowering workers, but today, with labor protections eroded and lobbying entrenched, no such rescue is coming. Marx would warn, without reform or revolution, the system will devour itself. In life, Marx felt defeated, exiled, and broke, wondering if anyone would read his dense tomes. Now picture his ghost scrolling the internet, seeing his face on protest signs, his words in rap lyrics, and "Eat the rich" memes. He'd grin. So, you did read the book. His fingerprints are everywhere: labor laws, unions, the 8-hour workday, even welfare systems. Not through conquest, but influence. In 2025, his ideas live in feminist marches, climate strikes, and gig worker unions. They're not prophecy, they're a method, a way to keep questioning power, even if the word Marxist is whispered rather than shouted. Marx would feel a rare emotion, hope. Hope that the specter he invokes still haunts the world, not as a threat, but as a promise. A promise that history can bend toward liberation, if we dare to push. So, what would Marx make of 2025? Proud that his ideas endure, even under a cloud of stigma. Vindicated that capitalism's contradictions, inequality, ecological ruin, eroded dreams, prove him right. Furious that exploitation persists, now coded into algorithms and corporate monopolies, and that his vision was betrayed by tyrants like Mao, Lenin, and Pol Pot. The promise of prosperity, a home, a family, a future, is slipping out of reach. Wages stagnate, debt crushes, and displacement spikes. Yet, in the cracks of this broken system, Marx would see sparks, movements demanding justice, sustainability, and dignity. He'd leave us with his sharpest line, truer than ever. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Will we?